Welcome to the last video for Unit 1, Lesson 4, Affirming Language, Identity, and Culture. In this video, you will examine how people affirm and protect their language and culture in a globalizing world. The video questions for understanding for this video are: Number 1, why is language important for our collective identity? Number 2, how is globalization challenging our collective identity through language? Number 3, how have some organizations in Canada attempted to affirm and protect language and culture? Number 4, how has the Canadian government attempted to protect language, Canadian culture, and identity with the CRTC? And number 5, do you think the Canadian government should regulate Canadian content on TV and radio? Why or why not? Earlier in this unit, you learned about collective identity, which is how our identity is shaped by the groups we belong to. This includes how our identity is shaped by the languages we speak and the culture we practice. Often people learn their language and culture from their surroundings they grow up in. People who speak the same language and practice the same culture often have similar views on things and have a stronger collective identity. It is believed that people develop their collective identity through language, that we learn our collective traditions, values, and culture through languages that are passed down by our parents and their parents and so on and so forth. Globalization is challenging our collective identities in a number of ways. One challenge is the disappearance of languages in the world. There are around 7,000 known languages spoken around the world, but most of the world's population only speaks about 12 of those languages. The most commonly spoken language on Earth is Chinese, spoken by about 1.2 billion people worldwide, followed by Spanish, English, Arabic, Hindi, Bengali, Portuguese, Russian, Japanese, and German. Because of this, lesser spoken languages are in danger of disappearing as people tend not to use them. More than half of the world's 7,000 languages are endangered, and about one language disappears in the world every 2 weeks. As for Canada, there are 190 distinct languages spoken in Canada. About 63% of Canadians speak English as their first language, 21% speak French, and 6% speak any of the other 188 languages. So what does this all mean? People who speak a language that isn't a majority don't need to worry about affirming and protecting their language because most people speak that language. However, if you speak one of the minority languages, you do have to worry about your culture and your identity because your language is in danger of being assimilated. So how have people attempted to affirm and protect their minority language in Canada? There are local organizations right here in Alberta that have attempted to affirm and protect their language through education. An example is the Ukrainian Cultural Heritage Village, which is located just outside of Edmonton. You've probably visited this place in elementary school. This is essentially an outdoor museum that teaches people about the heritage and history of Ukrainian settlers to Alberta dating back to the early 1900s. The performers all speak Ukrainian, and they dress in Ukrainian clothing, and they teach people about Ukrainian heritage. Another example of an organization that attempts to affirm and protect language in Canada is the First Nations University of Canada. This is Canada's largest First Nations education institution that is open to both Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal students to earn a university degree using a First Nations language or culture. It offers classes to people at the university and as well as online to learn a First Nations language, such as Cree, Dene, Dakota, Nakota, or Saulteaux. One more example is a film produced in Canada named Atanarwat, The Fast Runner, which was the first feature film ever to be written, directed, and acted entirely in the Inuktitut language of the Inuit in northern Canada. The film was produced in 2001 by Inuit Canadian filmmaker Zacharias Kunuk, who saw that the Inuktitut language and culture in Canada was in danger of being lost and decided to create a film dedicated to his language and culture about an Inuit story. Atanarwat, The Fast Runner, was a success both in Canada and internationally, winning a number of awards at major film festivals, Canadian Movie Awards, and was even nominated for an Oscar. Another challenge to our collective identities as Canadians is American popular culture. Most of the TV shows, movies, and music we watch and listen to in Canada are produced in the United States. As well, most successful Canadian actors and musicians have gone to the United States to work instead of staying in Canada. Canadian musical artists like Drake, The Weeknd, and Justin Bieber, and Canadian actors like Ryan Gosling, Seth Rogen, and Rachel McAdams have all left Canada to make it big in the United States. Some people in Canada feel threatened by the fact that most of our TV, music, and movies are dominated by American popular culture because I feel that there is a danger of Canadian culture being assimilated into American pop culture. Not to say that there aren't any good Canadian TV shows or musical artists in Canada. One of my favorite TV shows on TV was Corner Gas, which was filmed and produced in Saskatchewan. And I'm still a big fan of the Tragically Hip, which is a Canadian band that intentionally stayed in Canada rather than going to the United States to seek their fame and fortune. However, there are many more Canadian TV shows, movies, and artists who are uniquely Canadian that are relatively unknown because American media is so much more popular. So, how is Canada trying to protect Canadian culture from the dominance of American pop culture? The Canadian government has attempted to do this through a broadcasting regulation agency known as the CRTC, or the Canadian Radio, Television, and Telecommunications Commission, and also through legislation known as the Broadcasting Act of Canada. Created in 1968 by the Canadian government, the CRTC was established to regulate broadcasting and telecommunications in Canada. One example of how the CRTC regulates broadcasting with efforts to protect Canadian culture in the media is to create quotas for the amount of CanCon, or Canadian content in TV and radio. CanCon refers to TV programs, films, and musical artists who are produced in Canada. So TV shows like Murdoch Mysteries, This Hours is 22 Minutes, Kim's Convenience, or Trailer Park Boys, and musical artists like the Tragically Hip, Jan Arden, Sam Roberts, and Great Big Sea are all considered to be CanCon. The Canadian government established cultural content laws which regulate by law the percentage or quota of CanCon that Canadian TV and radio stations must include in their daily broadcasting. According to Canadian cultural content laws, at least 30% of all radio broadcasting must include Canadian content in their daily broadcasting schedule. As for TV broadcasting, at least 60% of all TV broadcasting on Canadian TV stations like CBC, CTV, and Global must include Canadian content. If Canadian radio and TV stations don't meet the required quotas of Canadian content, they can receive a pretty hefty fine from the Canadian government. In 1991, the Canadian government passed legislation known as the Broadcasting Act of Canada. This law set further regulations on Canadian broadcasting in TV and radio. For example, the Broadcasting Act states that Canadian broadcasting must reflect Canadian culture and values, such as bilingualism and multiculturalism and cultural diversity. As well, TV and radio programs are encouraged to represent Aboriginal and ethnic cultural identities in their programming. As a result of this, TV stations like the Aboriginal People's Television Network, or APTN, as well as Omni TV were created. APTN was created to reflect Aboriginal language and culture, and Omni TV includes multicultural programming other than English and French, so that you could watch a program in Chinese, in African culture, Latino, or Southeast Asian programs. So let's ask the question, should the Canadian government regulate Canadian content on TV and radio? There's a lot of controversy over the CRTC and the Canadian Broadcasting Act in Canada. Some people support the Canadian government's attempts to protect Canadian identity and culture on TV and radio. They believe that cultural content quotas and laws are necessary to keep Canadian culture from being assimilated into American popular culture. If it wasn't for the Canadian cultural content laws and quotas, some people believe that people just would not have the opportunity to see and listen to Canadian artists and wouldn't know about their own culture. However, some other people disagree with the Canadian government's attempts for a number of reasons. First, the CRTC and the Broadcasting Act do not regulate the internet, only TV and the radio. And as you know, society is changing to a more digital world, and more people are consuming their media online rather than on old media like TV and radio. Online media streaming sites like Netflix do not have to follow cultural content laws or quotas. And as sites like Netflix are growing in popularity over traditional TV, Canadian identity and culture is in danger of being taken over by American popular culture online. The Canadian government is considering amending the Broadcasting Act to include online media like Netflix, but there's resistance from this because Netflix is an American corporation and doesn't necessarily want to follow Canadian cultural content laws. Another reason some people disagree with the Canadian government's attempts to regulate TV and radio is that some Canadians just want to be able to choose whether they want to watch or listen to Canadian content on TV and radio. Some Canadians believe that Canadian TV shows and artists are not as entertaining and even are outdated when compared to TV and music from the United States. That as consumers, there should not be a legislated quota for Canadian content, and that people should be able to choose whether they want to watch or listen to Canadian shows or listen to Canadian artists. So, what do you think? Should the Canadian government legislate quotas on how much Canadian content there is on Canadian TV and radio? Or should we as consumers be given the choice if we want to watch and listen to Canadian TV shows and artists? This brings us to the end of Unit 1, Lesson 4 video. I will be gathering feedback from you about the use of these Unit 1, Lesson 1 to 4 videos, if they helped you learn the concepts or not. The videos will remain on the classroom website, so if you need to rewatch any of them for review for the Unit 1 exam, they're available for you. And there may be some ideas you can use for the Unit 1 assignment coming up. Until then, catch you later.